this idea of purity and you're never compromised and you're always politically woke and all that stuff. You should get over that quickly. The world is messy. There are ambiguities. Yep. People who do really good stuff have flaws. Like if I tweet or hashtag about how you didn't do something right or used the wrong verb, or then I can sit back and feel pretty good about myself because, man, you see how woke I was? I called you out. Let me get on TV, watch my show, watch Grownish. That's not activism. That's not bringing about change.
Hope and change. That's his call sign, right? I'm going to start here because this particular video was up. Obama is essentially aiming this at the left, so I would answer it as such. The man who went into one mic after the next, screaming at the height of his lungs about hope and change, is now saying, deaden your expectations. Deaden your expectations. Here's the catch. This, starting off, is on its face a straw man. Purity is relative. There is no such thing as absolutism in the sense of purity. It is relative to perspective. A Green Party member has a certain ideology of the world, and that purity would be in accordance to that particular ideology of the world. Just like a Democrat, just like a capitalist, just like a neo-lib, within the context of compromise is based on compromising around that particular ideology of the world. Compromise or purity in and of itself is not an absolute. This is somewhat of a straw man. It depends on ideology. What he is talking about is essentially voting for anything with a D beside its name and being angry at a backlash. What I mean by that is, yes, in part, vote for anything with a D beside your name. That's the kind of thing. But this goes beyond that. If you look at this, there's something else here. There's something else here. Seething. Bitter. Legacy. Ultimately, what we are calling woke, this notion of a woke culture of sorts, people waking up, people being aware, people being clear on what they want in the sense of the world and not being satisfied with the way the world is. The very existence of woke culture, the very existence of wanting and believing in big things and believing in transformational policies and sticking to those transformational policies. Yes, Medicare for all is my litmus test, but I'm willing to compromise on other things from the standpoint of domestic policy and everything else, and I suspect everyone else has those things to which they organize around. It's a straw man on its face. Obama's issue is that this notion of wokeness, of consciousness, of the belief in big things, the belief in vision, rebukes sublimely, straightforwardly, rebukes just the very existence of that culture, rebukes the last president. The shift that has taken place in the Democratic Party, what I would call a Democratic civil war, this pushback against neoliberal policies that have taken place over the last 40, 50 years. And Obama being in office just a few years ago, and now having a hegemonic shift within the context of the party that rebukes that legacy. This bristling at woke culture is because that woke culture woke up and say, yes, we can do big things. We can do transformational things. And no, hope and change, whatever that meant, was not necessarily imparted at the end of your administration. And with the Sanders coming into play, with the popularity of Sanders pushing those big programs like Medicare for all, expansion of Social Security, getting rid of college debt, legalizing marijuana. Those weren't things that were off the table, meaning they were impossible to do for Obama. It was a lack of will, imagination, and if we're being honest, intent of being a transformational president, despite using hope and change to leverage or to get votes off of those things, knowing that the public was looking for something fundamentally different in the political space. Obama's issue here is woke culture, but it's woke culture in the context of his own legacy. Ultimately, that woke culture criticizes, rebukes, and just its very existence of big things aggravates and burns. Let's talk about it. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support PayPal, Patreon. I had this video up last night, but I didn't necessarily have the energy to make this work at 4 in the morning. So I'm going to do this video now, and I'm going to try to be quick about the video because I just want to make my point before letting it go because I didn't like what he was getting at. If you get past the dripping condescension for the moment and what Obama was saying, there is something honest that goes beyond the straw man argument that he made of somebody catching you on Twitter with the wrong verb or something and sitting back. He's talking around the issue. Yes, he's talking about woke culture in that sense, but what he is talking about, woke culture and purity in the context of his own legacy and how people pushing these big ideas, these big plans are compared to his legacy just by its very existence. How can you not? He was the president only a few years ago. Interestingly enough, him making this, you can say, indirect argument of deaden your expectations. Well, let's be clear. It wasn't like Obama didn't do big things. You should give Obama credit. He did do big things. When Obama got in office and he picked up the drone wars that Bush stopped, Obama had a kill list, and with that kill list, pursuing that kill list, he expanded the drone program to heights that I think Bush would even be shocked by. The majority of the people that Obama was murdering in those drone strikes were civilians. The majority. Even if you say that's 70%, you can't even say at that point you're killing terrorists. You're just out there killing civilians. He upped the ante on this, again, this notion of big things, with funding terrorists and supporting and training head choppers and a clandestine operation in Libya. Meaning, first big geopolitical thing, take down Gaddafi. In which case, the U.S. was funding and arming head choppers and terrorists in order to go into Libya and then turn around when Gaddafi attacked back and say, this was a civil war, and we, NATO nations, need to take down Gaddafi, in which case you're bombing and killing. He called this a foreign policy win. That place is on fire. They sodomized Gaddafi, and at this point, you can buy your own black slave. How ironic. The first big geopolitical, quote-unquote, win that Obama was engaged in, now you can buy your own person who looks like him. Let's keep going. The second, in order to pursue the more geopolitical aims in this kind of big geopolitical ideas, was Syria. Meaning the same plan, the same tactic that he used in Libya, funding, arming, training, terrorists, head choppers, working with the areas in those regions, the Gulf states that we are allies with, in order to send those head choppers in, scream that it's a civil war, and then look for any pretext whatsoever to take down Assad. The entirety of that process was to take down Assad. And we were willing to fund head choppers and terrorists to do so. It's not a secret. In both cases, it's on the pages of the New York Times, Washington Post. You find instances of military-backed forces fighting CIA-backed forces. We, Obama, literally invaded a country in order to knock down the government of that country, leveraging the bravery around troops who got into the military with this notion of defending this country for a regime change war. Don't take my word for it. Even Trump comes out with it. And again, it was already on the pages of the New York Times, Washington Post, and all the media. The media covered it. Mainstream media didn't. They didn't care. Listen to Trump.
We've secured the oil, and therefore a small number of U.S. troops will remain in the area where they have the oil. And we're going to be protecting it and we'll be deciding what we're going to do with it in the future. In any event, by the move at regime change,
oil, another.
More than 500,000 people are dead on the ground in Syria. Obama's ill-fated push at regime change, U.S. troops are still on the ground in Syria. More than 500,000 people are dead. Hundreds of thousands are terribly injured, and millions more Syrians are displaced.
Everything that he just said in that statement was true. Obama, the guy who's screaming hope and change, who got the Nobel Peace Prize, in this moment, deaden your expectations of big things. Well, he was able to accomplish big things. 500,000 people died in that regime change war that he was pushing. Thousands, tens of thousands died in that war that he was pushing in Libya. And thousands, innocent civilians, also died in those drone wars. Who said you can't do big things? Obama was perfectly willing and able to do big things. It just so happened that they were utterly disastrous for the various people in the Middle East in regards to foreign policy. That is killing and death on a mass scale that is on his conscience as he sits here on this stage telling people, deaden your expectations. Ultimately, his issue is a persistent criticism of him just by the very basics and existence of a movement of people trying to do big things and reinstate the Democratic Party. It gets across what he wasn't just by virtue of what we are. It's not so much that you're absolutely pure. I have no idea what that means. It does mean that you have a certain degree of principle and that there are things that you believe in. One of those things, be it to not murder on a mass scale, to not spend billions of dollars in covert operations that ends up getting hundreds of thousands of people dead and killed, and to not support head choppers and terrorists. Yes, I do believe in things. And yes, on this particular point, you were wrong and you failed and you caused a lot of havoc and death on a mass scale. Own it. Own it. And the wild and interesting part is, despite the big geopolitical things that he was pulling off in regards to this mass amount of death that he was causing in the Middle East, it weirdly enough was in this kind of weird juxtaposition countered with what was taking place here in the United States. I mean, after all, Obama, for the most part, pushed policies despite what people thought he was going to push that were not in the interest of the people who were voting for him. 40% of the public struggling for their needs, meaning the overwhelming majority of the public don't have $500 in the bank in case there was an emergency. 78% of full-time workers living paycheck to paycheck. Over 500,000 people going bankrupt every year. And that's after Obamacare. That's after Obamacare. That was when this was supposed to be fixed. The top 1% controlling 38% of the wealth. $1.4 trillion in student debt. And then you have this other indignity that at the end of a guy who screamed hope and change into every mic, gave 95% of the income gains to the top 1%. Why are you shocked? Ultimately, Citigroup chose his staff, people, a policy. Class was the issue. He is sitting here telling you, deaden your expectations after running a campaign screaming hope and change. And at the end of screaming hope and change, the results are that 95% of the income gains go to the top 1%. Donald Trump could only best them by 5%. That is extraordinary. That is a scandal, and that is outright atrocious. And by the way, I didn't even mention Yemen, where we were working with the Saudis to starve and kill and weaponize disease, killing hundreds of thousands of Yemenis. He greenlit that war. That was another one of those foreign policy geopolitical strategies. Yes, he did it because he wanted to get the Iran nuclear deal. And yes, I agree with the Iran nuclear deal. By the same token, I don't agree with the mass murder and the mass death that he has on his conscience for these geopolitical and economic interests. 95% of the gains. Think about that. Let that settle. How does that feel? Everything that you do from the standpoint of work and labor and everything else within the context of your society, the people who pour the coffee, who do the streets, who write your programs, who keep the lights on, all of these people in our particular society that make this society work. And instead of that wealth, that labor, or the wealth of that labor, going back to the various people within the context of the society, under Obama, policy, not an act of God, 95% of it, top 1%. And despite setting himself on fire in order to protect the bankers, because none of them went to prison, between 2007 to 2016, the average wealth of the bottom 99% decreased by $4,500. This decline was particularly concentrated among housing wealth of African Americans. Outside of home equity, black wealth recovered in 2007, leveled by 2016, but the average black equity was still $16,700 less. Meanwhile, over the same period, the average wealth of the top 1% increased by $4.9 million. Hope and change. Hope and change. And now he's sitting here telling you to deaden your expectations. All of this is about an indictment of his legacy just by virtue of the political position that is being taken place or taking hold within the Democratic Party. And this is not taking place over the context of larger generations. This is taking place when he is awake, he is around, he was there from the standpoint of his particular presidency, and the tilt and tint of the Democratic Party going against that burns. It burns. Seething. Bitter. It burns. That's what this is about. Legacy. The fact that the Democratic Party, or elements of the Democratic Party, has shifted in its tint and shifted in a way that is to some degree diametrically opposed to the small, minimalist, lack of will and imagination, and lack of intent to do big things. And now you have candidates, or at the very least one, that is a true believer, that is trying to do big things. And he has a Democratic Party, all intents and purposes, that is on board for those big things, even independents on board for those big things. And you may even get a lot of right-wingers on board for those big things. And by definition, by the very existence of a candidate that is pushing for big things, that is a true believer in those big things, Obama is diminished by such. This seething condescension, this bitterness, has everything to do with this quote-unquote woke culture in its very existence being a persistent criticism, if not outright rebuke, of Obama's legacy. Everything from Medicare for All, which gets across the dysfunction and inadequacy of Obamacare, even the issue of climate, even the issue of drugs, even the expansion of Social Security when he was going to cut Social Security, even the increase in taxes when he enshrined Bush's tax cuts. I'm making the point that the prevailing narrative from one of the leading candidates, maybe you can argue too, repudiates Obamaism. And if you're going from a standpoint of a Sanders, even in the context of foreign policy, even in the context of Israel, across the board, transformational repudiation. Obama is sore about his legacy. And this visceral bristling on that stage, talking about wake culture, using a straw man for it, is what that is about. I could be wrong. I know he cares greatly about his legacy, so much so he told Joe Biden, or told his team, don't let Joe Biden screw up my legacy. And in this case, I would imagine if you're sitting at home and you're watching Sanders run, he's a true believer. He is talking about big things in the context of change, less hope. He's talking about action. He means it. You know he means it. And by definition, by very act that he exists and he is standing there, it gets across how minimalist your ideas were. Not to mention the failures regarding foreign policy. I'll end it here. Like, share, subscribe. Thanks all.